Hi there, Phil the Practical Gardener again. I'm filming this on a very cold morning, so I'm not actually wearing my Phil the Practical Gardener shirt. I'm just jacketed it up because otherwise I'm going to be a bit too cold. This particular tip is about some general aspects about pruning that I'm not covering in the specific tips that I've produced, such as heading and thinning cuts, or the timing of pruning through the different seasons of the year. So with this particular one, I'm going to cover some general aspects or techniques, such as how you should prune with smaller twigs or cuts, then with larger ones, things like narrow crotch angle, some general aspects about timing that I'm going to get onto in a moment. Without more ado, let's get into it. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the timing of pruning. I've got this branch here that I've just cut off an apple tree, and you can see in early winter it's still got its leaves on. So normally we would wait until these leaves are fallen off before we pruned it. There's a couple of reasons for that. When the leaves are fallen off, we can see the structure of the tree very easily, and so therefore it makes sense. Sometimes we say cut with the secateurs or the clippers in summer and the saw in winter. You would do your major structural cuts in winter with a pruning saw or loppers when you can actually see the structure. Second reason is that these leaves, when they're about to fall, the plant will withdraw the essential nutrients from that leaf and store them in the trunk. So if we were to cut that off too early, we would lose the value from that. The third reason is that if we cut it off when the tree is dormant, then it will initiate strong new growths in spring. It will respond appropriately when it is a natural time for it to produce vigorous growing. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily make sense. For example, this jacaranda tree. This is, in my environment, a weakly deciduous tree. Through the winter, it's got this beautiful fountain of foliage. I had a group of garden visitors here yesterday, and one of them commented, "What a gorgeous fountain it's making. It's looking really spectacular," as a result of the way I prune it. If I was to cut this back now, I would destroy that look, and it would look very bare for several months until it started to grow again. So I might as well keep it like this. When the foliage starts to look ratty in late winter, and then it will fall, I will then cut it off while the leaves are still on it, so I don't have to sweep them up from my courtyard. So what I'm suggesting there is think a little bit about the timing, about what makes sense in terms of that particular plant. Evergreen plants, for example, would be better to normally prune sometime during the spring or summer, because if you cut them off with a thinning cut and remove a twig, and perhaps it looks a little bit bare, it will normally regrow quite quickly and clothe itself up. If you were to prune an evergreen shrub or tree during the winter, it's actually going to look a little bit unusual until you get that vigorous growth regrowing. I'm going to discuss another aspect about this jacaranda tree too. A general recommendation is that you don't remove more than about a quarter of the foliage part of the tree or shrub or plant when you prune. That is because if you take off more, you will create an imbalance between the roots that are still their original size and the vegetative top plants of the plant. When I prune an apple tree, for example, I will take off sometimes quite a lot of it because it's just grown too big, or I want to rejuvenate it. Once I get to a certain point, I'll look at the amount of prunings that I've cut off, and I'll look at the tree and I'll think, if I take more off, it's going to overcompensate. It's going to produce a whole lot of epicormics, or water shoots as we call them, tall vigorous growths responding to the fact that a lot of the apical parts, the tip parts, have been removed and stimulating the other parts to grow. So sometimes it does make sense. With this jacaranda, I actually do it quite differently. I actually take off probably 3/4 of it, and it actually responds very appropriately, so it is perfectly happy with that. Also, near me there is actually a grapevine that it will be pruning soon. I take off enormous amounts off that because it actually encourages the tree to put all its energy into producing fruit and ripening that fruit. So there are exceptions, but generally speaking, taking off maybe a quarter of the plant does actually make sense. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about small cuts. So I have got this apple branch that I cut off a short while ago, and normally I promote thinning cuts rather than heading cuts. I have got a video on that. I suggest you watch it. At least 90%, probably 95% or more of my cuts will be thinning cuts. So if I wanted to cut this one here, for example, I would cut it right at the base. But sometimes we do want to shorten a stem, for example on a rose plant or a forsythia or another ornamental. I also do it sometimes on fruit trees such as citrus or blueberries or feijoa, where the plant has produced a flower or a developing fruit, but it's growing up quite strongly beyond that. I'll cut it just above that fruit. What we suggest that you do, if you're doing a heading cut on a thin stem, is that we cut it just above a bud. There's still leaf on here. This is the stem. There is a bud and what's called the axil point there. So we would cut directly above that. Now I've got my secateurs here. They have got an anvil side here and the blade cutting there. So that's the side that should be against the part that's going to remain on the tree. If we had the anvil side there, we can't get so close in, but also that will bruise the part that we're remaining. So going back to the stem, I prune just above the axil or the bud, and normally we cut just on an angle sloping away from the bud, round about half a centimetre or a quarter of an inch or so above it. If it's too close, it will dry off and the bud will die. If it's too far away, we create a stub, which is a source of disease. So I'll just cut one off here, following those principles. Also, I've pruned to an outward facing bud. So if the branch was like this, then I'm pruning to one that is facing outward from the tree rather than into the middle of the tree. It's to keep the tree open. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about bigger cuts. For example, if I wanted to remove this one here, thin this back to the main trunk here. If I cut out too far, again, I will have left a stub, and a lot of people who do this, that will not regrow, it will die back and it will allow disease to get into the main part of the plant. The plant finds it very hard to heal itself from there. If I cut it sharply across there, a flush cut we call it, along the line of the largest trunk here, then we're removing the natural conducting and healing part of the plant. So we actually need to have a compromise between the two. At the point there above the crotch between the two, there is a rough area of bark. That's called the bark ridge. We want to leave that on the tree. Down below it, there is a swollen area at the bottom. That's the branch bark collar. So we want to prune at the point just above those two there. Not a flush cut, not a stub cut. And again, if I was to prune that with my loppers, I would keep the blade side against the trunk and the anvil side away. My next topic is crotch angles. You can see that this is a good crotch angle between the branch and the trunk here, but this one here is very, very close, and that angle between the two will actually always be very weak. It will never build up strength. It will be prone to breaking, and when it does so, it will tear away and actually damage the rest of the tree. Therefore, normally we would remove this. I hadn't bothered earlier because it was only going to be a short-term lateral, but particularly if it was going to be a structural part of the plant, that is a long-term fruiting arm, we should make sure that it has got a wider angle. Normally, if this was vertical, around about 30% from the vertical is about ideal, 30 to 45% from the vertical. I've got two other topics that I wanted to cover. First of all, should you paint over the pruning cuts? A lot of sources recommend that you do so. Garden shops sell a range of pruning paste so you can make proprietary ones. I have got a friend who's been a commercial fruit grower and he said they did use pruning paste quite a lot. The studies that I've read suggest that you don't actually need to do so. In fact, it might even be detrimental to the plant health. I don't have a particularly strong opinion about this. Personally, I don't actually paste my cuts. However, when it comes to hygiene, one thing I am more careful about is the cleaning of my tools. So when I've finished a tree, with my secateurs or my loppers that I have here, I will rub with isopropyl alcohol or methylated spirits and give them a wipe. That is to avoid the risk of transferring disease, particularly virus disease, from one plant to another. So we remove the plant sap that would be carrying that disease. Sometimes with my pruning saw, I prune off soft material, and I actually get some soap and I give it a wash. I give it a wash down with soap, give it a good scrub with a scrubbing brush, and then rinse it off. Otherwise it's quite hard to get that sap off. I think that's the range of things that I was going to cover. If there are other things that you do wonder about, do put a comment into the comments section down below, or a question, because I'm always interested in looking at them and responding to them. And doing so does actually help to influence the algorithm to favour my channel better, because it has sort of stalled. I'm only increasing at about 100 subscribers a month. So liking, sharing, commenting are very, very good in terms of actually improving the exposure of my channel. So I do appreciate that. And finally, of course, thank you very much for watching this through to the end. Bye for now.